Hi, I'm Ashley Rodriguez, and I am going to be covering brain anatomy in the context of IONM. And this is going to be a pretty brief review of some of the most important structures that we've talked about during the semester. And it's just important to recognize that brain anatomy is important for the precision and effectiveness of neuromonitoring during surgical procedures. So I decided to kind of split these structures up into the cerebrum, brainstem, and cerebellum locations. And then in between each, I'll talk about some clinical applications and then go on to a conclusion. So to begin with the cerebrum, some of the major structures or regions of focus in IONM are the motor cortex, the somatosensory cortex, and the language and association areas. So to start off with the motor cortex, we see that here in the purple region that's located in the precentral gyrus. It's responsible for controlling voluntary movement. And we know that motor evoked potentials, or MEPs, are used to assess the integrity of the motor pathways that originate here, especially the corticospinal tract, which we talked a lot about in this class. And we know that accurate mapping can help avoid deficits in voluntary movement during tumor resections or epilepsy surgery. And then right behind that, we have the somatosensory cortex in pink here. That's the postcentral gyrus. And it's just important to see that those two regions are separated by the the central sulcus. So during surgery, it's very important to localize that central sulcus. That way we can differentiate the two regions and kind of receive proper responses. So the somatosensory cortex is responsible for processing sensation and proprioception, and somatosensory evoked potentials, or SSCPs, monitor the ascending sensory pathways, and SSCPs help ensure that surgeries do not compromise tactile or proprioceptive function. So that would be any surgeries that surround the parietal lobe or are close to it at all. Then we have the language areas, which are Broca's and Wernicke's areas. Broca's area shows up in orange here. It's located in the inferior frontal gyrus, and it has its collective function is to produce speech, and it has three different portions. We have the opercular part, the triangular part, and the orbital part. And they each have their own sort of functions and processes. Then we have the Wernicke's area, which is this large orange area right here. It's responsible for language comprehension, and it also has three separate parts. There's the supramarginal gyrus, the angular gyrus, and the superior temporal gyrus. And it's important to recognize each of these parts because each one has its respective associated deficits. So, for example, if during surgery there's some sort of slurring or hesitation during speech, it can kind of help the monitoring professionals or the surgeon kind of pinpoint where that deficit may be coming from. And we know that pen field mapping is the preferred form of cortical mapping for language. So, in general, for these language networks or these language cortices, it's mapping can be critical during resective surgery or for epileptic foci or tumors to preserve language and cognitive function. And ECOG and awake mapping are sometimes used to protect these very critical areas. So yeah, in general, for the cerebrum, it's just very important to know the gyri and the sulci so that we can navigate the cerebrum for effective electrode placement during different kinds of surgery. Then we have the brainstem, which is mainly composed of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. Its collective function is to control breathing, heart rate, and blood pressure, but they are also a little bit specialized. For example, the midbrain has the superior and the inferior colliculi, which help process visual and auditory information. So they work together as a network, but have their own specialized functions as well. And another important aspect of the brainstem is that it houses cranial nerve nuclei, especially the nuclei for cranial nerves 3 through 12. And monitoring these nerves with modalities like EMG can be crucial in surgeries involving the posterior fossa or anything near the brainstem. And then brainstem auditory evoked potentials, or BAEPs, are used to monitor auditory pathways and brainstem integrity, especially during surgeries where the brainstem may be at risk, for example, vestibular schwannoma removals. And it's also important to note that combining BAEPs with other neuromonitoring techniques can provide a more comprehensive overview of brainstem function. Then we have the cerebellum, which we didn't cover too deeply here in this course just because it's not directly monitored, but I do think it's important to look at because it carries some functions that are important during surgeries or postoperative functions as well. So we have some divisions. The vermis in orange here is important for trunk and proximal muscle control. Then we have the intermediate zones in yellow. That is for control or adjustment of movement of the intermediate limbs. Then we have in green the lateral hemispheres of the cerebellum, which are involved in coordination of skilled movement of more distal limbs. So, in general, the cerebellum is involved in voluntary movement, balance, and motor learning. And even though the cerebellum is less commonly monitored directly with things like evoked potentials, its role in ensuring smooth and coordinated movement is very important. And damage or dysfunction to this area can lead to ataxia or impaired movement. So, awareness of cerebellar function and location is important during procedures near the posterior fossa. And sometimes monitoring the output of cerebellar pathways can be achieved by observing changes in MEPs and SACPs because these signals can be affected if cerebellar structures or their connections are compromised. So preservation of cerebellar function is correlated with better postoperative motor coordination, which is why it's so important to recognize. So some general conclusions are that anatomy is foundational to IONM. Differentiating the functional regions of the cerebrum, the brainstem, and cerebellum is essential for safe and effective neurosurgery, and combining the knowledge of anatomy with IONM, our clinical benefits become that it helps surgeons avoid damage of critical structures and surrounding nerves. It provides real-time feedback for urgent intervention, and it supports functional preservation with decreased postoperative complications. And these are my references. Thank you.